Okay friends, it's time to get started on our rearward transmission mount. To do that, let's safely raise and support the vehicle so we can get underneath. Now from underneath the vehicle, let's have a look at the location of our mount. Looking at this large area here, this is considered your subframe. This stud right here is part of the mount. Directly above the sway bar here is where the mount's going to be located. Now a couple things to mention. This area right here is your exhaust. It could be hot if you just came back from driving, so make sure it's not hot to the touch so you don't get burnt. Speaking of hot, this area up here is a heat shield. It's supposed to protect everything behind here from getting damaged from the heat of the exhaust. With that said, we have to get this shield out of the way. Now right up on top of this shield, you're going to find two 10mm headed mounting bolts. There's one over on the driver's side and there's another one over towards the passenger side. It's going to be easiest to get this with a flexible head ratchet. I'm just going to carefully get this up here. Once again, we're sure that the exhaust is not hot in any way, so you do not get burnt. There's one of my bolts. Now I'll do the exact same thing on the passenger side. All right, let's grab that screw, get it out of here. All right, so now we can move this shield around and let's have a look from the front up along the top of that power steering rack. You can see this little tab right here. Now this tab leads to the wiring that goes right up above it, essentially holds it in place. So we don't want to break it off. We're just going to go ahead and squeeze these two ears. And then while we're squeezing, we'll also try pressing it up at the same time, and that should release it from this shield. Let's go ahead and grab onto that shield. We're going to give it a little wiggle and try to remove it from the area. So now at this point, we have access to all three of our mounting nuts. There's this one down here, which we already saw, and then right up above there, underneath where that shield was, you can see two more 15mm headed nuts. For this, I'm going to use a flexible head ratchet and my 15mm socket up along the top, and we'll use a deeper socket for the lower one. Inspect your hardware as you start removing it and set it aside. From under this area here, there's going to be two bolts that you need to remove for the lower aspect of the transmission mount. To remove these, you're going to use a T47 Torx bit. Go ahead and remove those bolts. Give them a quick inspection when you remove them to make sure the thread is still good for reinstallation. Now with those two bolts out of there, this can move around fairly freely, but it's still going to be trapped in this area due to this bracket that goes right up above the mount. Now for that mount, to be able to get it out of here, you're going to have to come in between the transmission and the subframe. Right up inside this area, you're going to find three bolts that you're going to have to remove. I'm going to start using my 15mm to remove these. Once you have them broken free, you can continue on with a ratchet wrench. Just keep in mind, you don't want it to get trapped in this area as you remove each bolt. Inspect your bolts, set them aside. Now the next thing we're going to have to do is apply some gentle pressure underneath the transmission pan. When you do this, you only want to do it in an area that has a corner, never in the center of the pan, which will of course cause some serious damage to your transmission. Now the area that we need to jack is along the back here, so I'm just going to get along this ridge with a nice flat piece of wood, so I'm going to be able to expand all that pressure along a large surface. Now I can start carefully jacking this up, making sure I'm making no damage along the way. Let's pay attention to this bolt right up in this area. Once we have enough room to be able to access it, we can stop. There's that one. Now for that last bolt on the bracket, you can easily see that right up above the sway bar. If you look straight in there, you're going to find that last 15 millimeter headed bolt. Now if you needed to, you could either raise or lower the transmission, and that's going to make it so this bolt will be easier to remove. Once you have it in proper placement, go ahead and remove it. Now I'm going to reach inside here, grab onto that bolt so it doesn't fall. Carefully remove it, keeping in mind that there's nothing holding the bracket in at this point up along the top, in exception of your rubber mount. Inspect your bolt, set it aside. Now we can work on getting this out of here. I'm just going to wiggle this around. Basically what we need to do is get the bracket off of those top studs. Once they're off of there, we can go ahead and fully remove the bracket. I'm just going to wiggle this around. There it is, friends. Okay, friends, it's time to get started on replacing our brand new mount. Looking up at the top stud of the mount, you're going to see that it has this metal tab right here, which will essentially just unscrew from the area. And underneath that, you're going to have a lock washer. We need to go ahead and remove the lock washer and this tab, set those aside from both of the studs. Then we can continue installing this into the vehicle. Set that aside. Grab that lock washer. We're going to set that aside as well. Do the exact same thing over here, and then let's get it in. Let's take the mount in this position with this facing towards us or the rear of the vehicle. It's going to line up right here. As we start lining this up, you also want to line up the bracket so it can mount on top of those two studs. Now we need the bottom stud in here as well, obviously. Let's just double check to make sure the bracket's sitting on both of those studs. It's also sitting inside this area. Now we can start on our mounting hardware. Generally, I recommend to use a little bit of red thread locker on each of the studs. Now we'll use our new lock washers, put those right up along those top studs. Start on both of your upper mounting nuts. Now that we have those started, let's go ahead and put on our lower mounting nut as well. Now let's snug them up. Now at this point, we're leaving this lower stud loose. The reason why we want to do that is because we need to be able to move this mount around so we can line it up with the transmission. Once we start in all of our mounting bolts, we can continue on by snugging up this stud nut. Now we can start putting in our other 3 bolts. Like I said, we can easily move this mount around. We'll line up our holes, start in each of these bolts. We will not tighten any of them up until we have all of them started. Let's get that last bolt. Bracket around. All right, at this point we can start tightening up these bolts. I'm going to start with the hardest one, only because if I need to move the bracket around a little bit, it would be a lot easier while everything else is still loose. Make sure it's nice and tight. All right, onto this one. Make sure it's tight as well. Now we can carefully start lowering everything back down. While we're doing that, we also want to be paying attention to these two holes here to make sure everything lines up. We'll go ahead and put in those two bolts, snug them up, and then we can do our last nut. Let's grab those two bolts with some red thread locker. We can start each of them into their corresponding holes. If it feels like it doesn't line up, just grab onto that mount, give it a little wiggle, and should be able to line up for you. Once you get a few good threads in there, you can continue on by tightening them up. Let's use our T47 Torx bit to tighten these up. Let's get this one. Now we can start torquing everything. Let's start with these three bolts. As you can tell, the lower one and the one that's up at the very top will be the only two of these bolts that you can torque. This one over here is very close to the power steering rack bolt, and there essentially isn't any way to be able to torque that. Let's torque each of these bolts to 46 foot-pounds. Get that top one as well. Now we'll come underneath this area and start torquing all this as well. All these are going to be torqued to 37 foot-pounds. Now we're going to try to get our torque wrench up here as well. If you can't get it to fit, of course you just want to make sure they're nice and tight. We're going to torque each of these nuts to 37 foot-pounds. Let's get this shield back in place. Grab both of your mounting bolts. We're going to start each of them in. Once they're each started, we can snug them up. Now that I have them both started, I'm just going to go ahead and tighten them. When you tighten them, you just want to make sure they're nice and snug. There isn't a torque spec for these. Obviously, it would be very difficult to get a torque wrench up there. Okay, so right there, it feels as though it's bottomed out. I don't want to break this bolt off. It's just a very small bolt. Just make sure it's nice and tight. Once we tighten them both, we'll give this shield a shake and make sure it's completely secure. Okay, it's bottomed out. Make sure it's nice and tight. Now that we have them both tight, just go ahead and grab onto that shield, give it a little wiggle to make sure it's secure. Obviously, it's going to wiggle a little bit, but it shouldn't actually be able to flop around and or hit against anything such as your lines that are behind it or even the mount. The purpose of the shield is to protect everything from the heat, so it should not be touching anything.